Well, welcome back to Breaking Par. I'm your host, Bernard Sheridan, and this is episode 61. We are going to speak with Dr. Sasho MacKenzie from St. Francis Xavier University. He is an expert in golf swing biomechanics and has worked with such notable instructors as Tiger Woods' new instructor, Chris Como. So sit back and enjoy this episode. This is an extra long episode. And of course, Breaking Par is powered by Swing Guru 3D software, The Right Move. So sit back and enjoy, and without any further ado, here's our guest, Dr. Sasho MacKenzie. Dr. MacKenzie, welcome to Breaking Par.
Thank you.
So thanks for taking your time out today to be with us. We have a ton of questions to ask you because your wealth of knowledge, and we're really looking forward to finding out about all these questions. So the latest thing in golf instruction right now that is going around in social media and in a lot of the better instructional circles is ground force and how it affects the golf swing, and center of pressure and center of mass, and really, how does that affect ball flight and things of that nature? So, in your opinion, what do you think in those two things, in other words, center of mass, center of pressure, is really more important for us to be looking at or for students to be getting the information about in golf instruction at the moment?
That's a good question. I think that with center of mass, we can see how the center of mass is moving much more clearly from a video than we can center of pressure. And I think every golf coach today would have video being used during a lesson, or at least have the potential for that. So I think with center of mass, there's actually not going to be a whole lot of difference, say, at the elite level in terms of maybe what matters and how you're moving it, just looking at center of mass. Maybe at the high handicap level, you have some golfers who aren't moving their center of mass towards the target. I think invariably, I can't think of a pro golfer who doesn't move their center of mass towards the target. It's going to be very challenging to measure how much the center of mass moves in what I would call an anterior posterior direction or heel toe direction anyway from video, and it's a very small movement in the average golfer anyway, even in the from tour to the amateur level. So I don't think that center of mass movement would tell us a whole lot. So I think really it's probably going to be the center of pressure movement that might be more important if I was going to pick out one between the two of those. And that's where you can see with center of pressure movement a lot more variability in the high handicap golfer and on the tour. So while center of mass traces might generally look the same on tour in terms of a magnitude or the fact that they're always moving towards the target and there's very little heel toe movement, the center of pressure traces can look a lot different. And really, when it comes right down to it, if you really want to figure out what's important, you really have to look at both of them, and it's really the kind of the relationship between the two, and more specifically, the direction of that ground reaction force vector that's coming out of the center of pressure point, that I think is maybe the hot topic right now, or at least something that's of interest in the biomechanics of golf area.
Sure. So, and players create that center of pressure, or I want to say ground force, in a couple different ways, correct? Am I correct in assuming that vertically and rotationally?
I think that there's going to be a ground force under each foot. So it's kind of like the spot where your average spot of pushing down under each foot. And really, you can picture like two angled rods coming out from each foot, representing a net direction that the golfer is pushing and a net location that they're pushing on the ground. it's the interaction of those forces that can also create a rotational component to the ground reaction force or torque. So in that sense, there are, I guess, two ways of looking at it. There's the linear components to the ground reaction force, and then there are the torques that those produce. Yeah, I'm maybe not answering your question specifically.
Okay, so the torques that they produce are more rotational torques, correct?
Yeah, any torque is going to be rotational.
Okay.
Yeah, any torque is going to be rotational, and generally, any torque you have is going to be the result of a force as well. Yeah, so torques are kind of the byproduct of a force acting at a distance from something. With golf, and we're looking at, what is the ground force or the ground forces underneath each foot? How are they going to contribute to the rotational movements? We're going to want to look at how far those forces are acting away from the golfer's center of mass. So if we have somebody hit us, you think of two football players colliding, and a football player, drives his shoulder right into another football player's center of mass where they're located, it's going to push him straight back. There's not going to be any rotation. But if that football player, let's say, tackled low, drove his shoulders into the other football player's knees, now that force is going to be at a distance from the center mass. So now we're going to get linear motion, but that football player getting hit at the knees is also going to rotate. So those forces acting at our feet, if they pass past the center of mass, they don't go through the center of mass, then that's where we're going to get the rotation from the forces.
Okay, so as an average player, let's look at that for a second. And what I consider average is anywhere from a 10, maybe an 8 to a 15 handicap. I think the majority of the students that I deal with are somewhere in that realm, and I consider that average. So as that average player, and we're looking at center of pressure, how can we control swing path through that? So in other words, if we're studying center of pressure, then let's say that player is more on their toes or their heels. How is that going to affect their swing path? And what can they do to, let's say, have a path that's more in to out as opposed to out to in? And what would we be looking for in that situation?
Sure, that's a very good question. Well, there's no absolutes with center of pressure and club head path that I can see. However, there would definitely be some tendencies. So you can't make any hard and fast rules. There's not a direct physical connection with how you're applying force into the ground and what the club's doing. So center of pressure, just maybe to clarify, is really just looking at how much harder you're pushing down with the left foot versus the right foot. That's going to tell you where the center of pressure is.
Yes.
In between the 2 feet in terms of it along the target line direction. And then how much harder you're pushing down with, say, the heels versus the toes, that's going to determine where it is in your kind of heel-toe direction. So it's really just looking at the vertical force. So that being said, with any given center of pressure trace, it's quite possible, given the number of degrees of freedom we have as a golfer, to move the club head as it's passing through the ball in really any manner. So you could have an in-out path with any type of center pressure trace. You could have an out-in path with any center pressure trace. That being said, though, from the golfers that I've had in my lab and from my own personal experience, certainly seems that there's a tendency to have the trace go from the heel towards the toe during the downswing, and not necessarily all the way from the heel to the toe, but if you're going to have an in-out path. If as you get more, what I would say, I guess, more linear, so a trace that would go more from, say, midfoot to midfoot, the path is going to start to zero out, so to speak. But those are just, some tendencies or averages. Certainly there's no hard and fast rules. There's lots of ways the body can move to get similar center pressure traces.
Sure. So players, let's say a player has a tendency to get their weight out over their toes more. Center of pressure would probably show up as more on their toes, correct?
Yes, I would say that's yes.
Okay. So assuming that, would that player normally have an easier time swinging out to in than they would in to out?
That's a good question. I think the timing of when they move their center of pressure out would matter, and it gets complicated. But I also think that would what would also factor in is the golfer's sense of their ability to maintain balance.
Yeah.
So I think if a golfer can still finish in a balanced position, then having that center of pressure move from the heels to the toes is probably more likely to produce a draw or an in-out path. But you can get some players that if they do that to the extreme sense where they are worried about actually falling over forwards onto past their toes, then that can really result in a reaction in the body where you would get the body trying to move. So the center of pressure move towards the toes, the upper body is going to come out of the shot, and you might actually get an out to in path, resulting in a slice. But if you were to take the average tour player, my guess, if you told him to play a draw, or the average decent handicap player, you might tend to see a path that is of the center of pressure that it goes more from heel to toe. But if you get that extreme, and now all of a sudden the golfer's not just moving their body in a way that makes a good golf swing, but they're moving their body in a way to make sure they don't fall over. Now you can get all sorts of things happening. So those tendencies can leave if the golfer's making movements both to maintain balance and to swing the club.
Right. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is I'm trying to make it so it's a little bit easier for the average player who listens to the show to understand that if they can be in balance, it's really hard for them to stay in balance if their weight is more on their balls of their feet or on their toes. And it's really difficult for them in the same sense to stay in balance if they're more on their heels, if they're more feeling like they're kind of over their instepped or right around the back of the balls of their feet. They're going to feel a lot more balanced. They're probably going to make a better swing. I think that a lot of players who are higher handicap, they don't kind of even think about that or even feel it. Or I want to say they might feel it, but they're not conscious of that feeling. So my basically my reason of questioning here, or I want to say the thought that I'm trying to get across to our listeners is that you don't want to be on your heels or your toes. You want to stay in balance. It's going to help you produce more of an in-to-out swing than an over-the-top swing on average. And of course, there's always rules that are going to change due to the ability of a player. But can a player be more consistent if they have more of a linear ground force? And can a player be more consistent if that ground force is more somewhere in the middle of their feet as opposed to their heel or toe?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that instead of saying maybe a more linear ground force, I would say if that center of pressure trace doesn't get close to the external boundary of the feet, so what's called the base support, that probably tells me that there's a pretty controlled movement of their center of mass, and that's going to give from a probability standpoint over a whole bunch of swings. If you're keeping your center of pressure trace more in the middle of that base of support, not going really towards your heels or really towards your toes, that means that you're not going to have the odd swing where your body reacts during the swing to say, hang on, let's stop focusing on making a good golf shot, and let's make some slight movements here that are going to keep us in balance. So if you have that a more tighter center of pressure trace, I think that you're going to avoid those swings where balance issues would come into play. And I think, that doesn't hold for everybody. There are certainly people on tour that have some pretty wacky center pressure. Wacky, they don't look linear center pressure traces, but they're still able to be relatively repeatable. But I would say there's an awful lot of guys out there that have very linear center of pressure traces, especially with their irons on tour.
Now, speaking of on tour, do you think that, because there's a lot of things that as students or of the game, they'll look to tour pros to try to emulate that because they feel that tour pros are the pinnacle of the sport, and they're trying to get their body to do what a tour pro does. Now, I know from my experience with the majority, because I don't teach a lot of tour pros. I don't work with a lot of tour pros. I work with a lot of I want to say anywhere from a 5 handicap to a 25 handicap. I have some in my stable that are lower than that. I've got a couple players who are pluses, but as an average, that's not really what I'm working with. And I think that as an average of players across that play golf at all, they're definitely not in that category. It's a lot. I find it's a lot more difficult for them to emulate. Should we be really looking at those type of studies more to try to emulate those because it maybe is out of our reach, or should we be looking at what a little bit more, let's say, a low handicap player does? I mean,
that's a good question. I think center of pressure trace might be a little different. I think certain variables that you might measure from a tour pro maybe aren't so appropriate to compare. You're constantly working on trying to get your 8 handicapper, 8-year-old male who's maybe a little bit out of shape and lost a little bit of his flexibility to get his hand position at the top of the backswing the same as Adam Scott's. I think that maybe that's something where, okay, we're not going to try to emulate that. That's going to, result in some things that maybe can't be done. As far as, maybe trying to emulate a center of pressure trace pattern, that should be doable. Whether you want to do that or not is another question, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad way to go. With respect to center of pressure traces, maybe just to clarify my view on them, I think that I would probably tend to use center of pressure traces not to try and match as an ideal, but I would say, okay, we don't exactly know what the ideal center of pressure trace is. Maybe there hasn't been enough study done on it. Maybe there's just too much variability, but it's pretty difficult to say this is the ideal center of pressure trace from a scientific standpoint. That's where I think it's quite acceptable to look at what the best people in the world are doing. And this is, I think, what the best instructors have done over time, right back into the 1800s in any sport. What's the best person doing? Well, at least I can try to emulate what I think are the important parts of that. So if there's a paucity of scientific evidence to suggest this is the best way to do it, then if you look at that elite player and you can try to reason what they're doing, or a whole bunch of them are doing, they all seem to be doing the same thing, it's probably not a bad way to go. Everybody in high jump seems to be, doing the Fosbury flop and winning. Hey, maybe there's something to that. Maybe we don't understand the biomechanics of it yet. I don't think Dick Fosbury did, but hey, it's probably not something that's bad for me to maybe attempt. Maybe, it's certain before the scientific evidence comes along to support it. It's not a bad way to go. Specifically with center of pressure, I wouldn't look at a player's center of pressure trace and think that I need to fix that. I would still be looking at the body's movements, the club's movements. What's the club doing? What I want the club to do. I would be using, if I was a coach, a center of pressure as another way to provide feedback to get the body moving the way I want it to move. So if I thought a golfer had a pretty good swing and they were hitting the ball very well, let's say a guy coming out of a mini tour and happened to show up at the doorstep and said, hey, I just want something, I just want someone to look at my swing. Maybe is there something in there that could give me an edge? And if, we put him through a launch monitor, combine with a TrackMan or flight scope, and they're 4 irons, 245 carry, and they got a really tight pattern, and they can hit all the shots. And then we're like, all right, well, let's just collect some center pressure data and some ground reaction force data. And I saw that his center pressure data wasn't particularly linear, and it kind of backed up maybe at some point in the swing. I wouldn't even share that information with them. Now, if there was something in their swing, and I thought, okay, this is something that maybe we should correct. I think that this person's maybe shifting a bit too soon. The downswing, I see the way their body's moving. I want to change that. I would look to the center of pressure trace to see if maybe there's some information that could confirm that, and then I would maybe use that as a possible feedback mechanism for the player to help address that issue. I would probably first take as global perspective, as an external focus perspective as possible. If there's something wrong with the ball flight, okay, can you change the ball flight first? No. Okay, well, that didn't work. Then maybe I'd actually move to, can you try to move your body this way to actually maybe directly address what they're doing with their body? Can you feel like you're moving your body this way? Feel like your elbow's doing this? Feel like you're whatever. Then that wasn't working, or maybe it kind of worked, we saw some improvement, then I would probably pull out the center of pressure trace and say, look, let's correct this. Hey, there's a good swing. You corrected that movement. This is what changed in your center of pressure trace. This is why. Let's see if we can feel this in the way you're using the ground, right? Maybe the way you're using the ground, the way you're shifting your pressure from your heel to your toe, from your back foot to your front foot, gets better at the change in the overall movement pattern that we're looking for. So some golfers may respond better to that than they do directly looking at a video or other sets of feels.
Has there ever been any studies ever done on pressure trace on uneven lies?
No, not to my knowledge. I'm pretty confident that there hasn't been.
Do you think that would be beneficial? Because I know that many players, when you're on the golf course, we're not seeing a lot of even lies. So if maybe we had an opportunity to look at how some of these uneven lies affect our ground forces and our balance and our center of pressure, that we might be able to pull off those shots a little bit better when we're in those circumstances?
Sure. I mean, immediately what comes to my mind would be, if you have a player that struggles with, I would say, to take it a little more straightforward at the start. So let's just say a downhill lie where, it's kind of flat in terms of from your heels to the toes out to the ball, but your trail foot's a lot higher than your lead foot.
Sure.
And, maybe your player's struggling that way. Well, if I had a bunch of tour pros that could make that swing, maybe you got a guy, that just is money off a downhill lie. Well, I would want to know, this is kind of the start of a scientific approach, but really let's just see what the best player does, because I don't really see any initial logical way how a certain movement pattern would be beneficial from a downhill lie. So let's take this player who always seems to be able to hit balls really good off a downhill lie. Maybe there's 2 or 3 of them. Let's put them on a downhill lie, put them on the pressure mat. Maybe it turns out that all these guys always keep all their weight or the majority of their pressure on their lead foot. They just never go to the trail foot. Maybe that's what happens on an uphill lie. But that's what I would look at, and then I would see what my player's doing. And to me, that would be, if I had 3 or 4 guys on tour and they seemed to really be really good at downhill lies, my guy wasn't, I'd look for a pattern with the good players. And then, at least through practice, I would say, hey, let's see if trying to emulate what they're doing is going to result in you finding some more consistency on that downhill lie. But I think that's a great question.
What about knockdown shots or chipping or things like that? I know that in chipping, when we talk about when you see instruction on chipping, most of them say get your weight forward, stay on your front foot, things like that. So have you ever done any study in that way of pressure points or center of mass and how it's affected in maybe those type of shots and how we can look at that information and then better try to emulate that for the average player? Because sometimes I feel like if I can get a player to kind of do those things and try to recreate a trace, they feel it a lot better right
Sure.
away.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I can say, okay, here is the best chipper on tour, and this is what he's doing, and this is where his center of mass is, and this is where his center, this is where his weight is going, and this is where his pressure is, and so let's try to emulate that. Have we ever done any type of studies like that?
No, but I'm sure there are people out there using existing technologies that probably are doing that. There's, to my knowledge, no studies in chipping. There's a handful on putting with center of pressure.
Okay.
Relatively inconclusive, in my opinion. I think it's helpful if you have that device, like a body track or a SAM balance plate or the swing catalyst. I don't necessarily know the names of all those specifically, but I think it'd be helpful if the golf instructor has a clear idea of what they want to have happen. I want to see 80% pressure on the lead foot in the address position when we're hitting this type of chip shot. See marginal shift to the trail, very minimal. I want to see not too much motion. And you've got a player that's not doing that. They're all over the place, right? I think that's a perfect example. If we look at it from, if you ask my personal opinion on what would be optimal, I would say that once you remove the requirement of a relatively high club head speed, I think you're going to be it's going to be very difficult to convince me that there are certain center of pressure traces or patterns that would be more optimal. Not saying that's not the case, but that's where I'd be just as willing to listen to a tour instructor who says, hey, you know what, I've been around for 30 years. This is what I've seen all the best chippers do, and this is why I'm teaching it. And I'd say, okay, fair enough, but my gut would tell me that you could take Phil Mickelson, put him on a skateboard, have him stand on only his trail foot, roll him down the cart path, and he'd be able to nip these balls off the off the fairway. There's a lot of degrees that we have a lot of degrees of freedom as golfers, and there's probably a lot of ways to putt and to chip. Now, that's where I'd probably default to a golf instructor, especially when it comes to consistency. I think we have a pretty good idea about what's going to generate a lot of club head speed. Not perfect, but a pretty good idea. When it comes to consistency, it's currently the wild west. I'm not even aware of a study in any sport, or even for that matter, any movement pattern. Pick a skill, typing a key on your keyboard that suggests this movement pattern will lead to more consistent results. So that's where we get to with chipping and putting. I think there's probably a lot of ways to get it done. That being said, if you have a ton of experience or a pretty sound reason behind why this is going to work better than other techniques, and I think that if you think that relates to how a person's center of pressure will move around, pull out a body track mat and have a person chip and use that as a way to give feedback. It's perfect if you believe in a certain method.
Now, in that little infinite point of wisdom that you just laid on our listeners, you mentioned in that club head speed and that you know how to create more club head speed. How would our listeners do that in general? Because I think that a lot of players, they think that that's the holy grail. More club head speed, more club head speed, more club head speed. I believe it's I think that club head speed has a lot to do with it, but I think that the efficiency of strike has more to do with it, and which helps raise the smash factor. So it's really, I guess, ball speed is really more important to me, or at least what I try to get across to my students. But if you can create that and create more club head speed at the same time, then all those numbers are going to go up if it's an efficient strike. So in your opinion, what is the best way for them to try to make that happen?
Well, I think that with club head speed, this is where you can pretty much look at it for the most part from a mechanics standpoint. You got an object, the golf club. You want the end of it moving as fast as possible. At the start of the downswing, it's not moving. So that creates a very relatively, in my mind, simple scenario for what's going to generate the most speed. You can look at it from two perspectives in mechanics. There's one that's called work energy and another one that's called impulse momentum. Let's take a look at from a work energy perspective. If you have something and you want to have a whole lot of velocity, that means you want to maximize its kinetic energy. That's the golf club. We want to maximize the kinetic energy of the club head at impact. So that means if we look at this work energy relationship, or from a work energy perspective, at the top of the swing, the club's got no kinetic energy. The amount of work done on it, if we do more work on the club between the top of the swing and impact, the more kinetic energy it's going to have. So then that means we want to maximize the work the golfer does in the club. Well, you say, okay, well, what's work? Work is force over a distance, or torque over an angular distance. So if we stop talking theory here for a second and actually pick a player, why does Jamie Sadlowski swing the club faster than Adam Scott? Well, they both translate the club a considerable amount. Both of them have their hands very high in the swing. That's why Adam Scott's got a higher club head speed than me, and that's why Jamie Sadlowski has a higher club head speed than me. So the more we can move that club linearly through space, so you can think of someone's, I think the easiest way to think of that in layman's terms is how high are the hands getting above the head and, away from target. So that arc that you're going to move the club head through, the whole club through, and then you've got how much it's going to rotate angularly. So I use Adam Scott because he's got a really nice high hand position, as does Jamie Sadlowski. Where is Jamie Sadlowski getting some more of that from? Well, if you look at the actual angle the club's at, Jamie's is almost coming down, vertical again, right? He's got so much wrist cock, whereas Adam's maybe closer to 90 degrees. He's kind of close to shaft parallel. Well, a lot of that club head speed's coming from that extra rotational work that Jamie's doing on the club. So really, you want to hit the ball further, apply forces and torques for a longer period of time. So you want to, for the average golfer, if you had to do one thing, I'd have them gain more flexibility in the backswing. You want to apply forces for a longer period of time. There's really a limit to how high those forces can get. That's why you can see, you don't really want to be huge. Sure, the average long drive guy's pretty big. Jamie Sadlowski has been doing pretty good for the last 8 years in the World Long Drive competition. He's not, 250 pounds of muscle. Certainly it helps, it's going to add a little bit, but by far and away, the most important thing that the average person could work on would be their flexibility to move that club through a bigger range of motion.
So in that same token, though, don't you find that a lot of average players who try to do that lose consistency of motion and lose accuracy?
Yeah, I certainly think that's fair to say. I would say that if it's probably because this is me speculating from my own experiences with the average player. If you said, okay, for this swing, I want you to take it further back. Now they're getting into really end ranges of motion. Extra joints are starting to extend beyond where they probably should to be consistent. What I would say is if they actually improve their flexibility, so the amount of torso rotation they could do, how much their lead arm could come across their chest, and still felt the same level of comfort, so they got to the back of the swing, they're like, I feel comfortable. I feel like I can move in other directions from here. I'm not, at the absolute end range of every joint without completely coming out of my posture, so to speak. Then I think you would see an increase in club head speed without much detriment in consistency. I think they'd still find the center of the face, so to speak. But I think it's trying to artificially add that without actually improving your level of flexibility. To give you an example, maybe an extreme one, if we look at, say, we take a putt, there's really small ranges of motions of most joints. We're really not moving the club head that fast. And you look at, okay, what's the variability in face angle? If Bernard, if you hit 10 putts, let's say it's plus or minus a degree over those 10 putts face angle. Now let's go to the extreme. Let's take you with a driver. Well, given now that we've got this club head moving as fast as you can move it, you've incorporated almost full range of motion at a whole bunch more joints, range of motion at dozens more than that. Yet, if we looked at you hitting 10 drives, would there be a proportional increase in your variability in face angle? I say no. And what about where you hit it on the face? A proportional increase? I say no. I say so. My point being is that it's probably worth working on flexibility to get the club moving through a bigger range of motion. I think that with marginal practice, you won't see an increase in the variability in the swing, and you'll benefit from that flexibility. If it's truly you're gaining actual mobility at joints and not just forcing yourself to take the club back further.
Sure.
That makes sense.
Sure. So, and you spoke that a good example with Jamie is that he creates a tremendous amount of lag coming down. Now, that's not as much of a flexibility issue as it is just being able to maintain lag longer before release, correct?
That's a good question. I would say they're in his case inextricably linked. I'd say that a lot of those long drive guys, John Daly's a good example. He's probably got some really freaky things happening in his hands that allow him, in his fingers, that allow him to get that amount of wrist cock. I'm not even sure if, without really relaxing his grip, even if he wanted to, a guy like Adam Scott could get into that position that Sadlowski or John Daly could get into. So I think at that extreme range, and even for the average handicapper, I think a lack of hand flexibility, and that's probably a really tough thing to improve, can actually really limit how much lag you could retain. That being said, if I was going to pick, one thing that would if I was to guess, it would proportionally show a bigger increase in clubhead speed without sacrificing repeatability. I would rather see the hands get higher than increasing the, we'll call it wrist cock, or the amount of lag. If I had to pick one of those two, could Jamie probably still swing it at 140 miles an hour with keeping the shaft parallel at the top of the swing? Yeah, probably, as opposed to say 150. That's my guess.
Right. So, lag to you, it's more the width of the swing that's going to help build more club head speed than the lag itself, even though lag can also create more club head speed.
Yeah, if I was going to pick one, because it's probably going to be easier to get out of your amateur golfer. I think the flexibility at the joints that will allow you to get your hands moving through a bigger arc. You have more options for that, and I think you're going to get more bang for your buck than trying to work on hand flexibility. And two, my gut feeling tells me that you will see if you're looking at, as you pointed out, you want to increase club head speed, but you want to also maintain as much consistency as you can. I think that's where you're going to get your best bang for your buck is working on those. The flexibility of those joints are going to allow you to move your hands through a bigger arc than increase the lag.
Well, that's true. That I think that if you can up your flexibility point, you should be able to stay more stable in your swing too and make a bigger arc, as opposed to if you don't have that flexibility, you're going to try to do things and then it's going to take you out of your center or your balance point on the backswing going to the top, which can now translate into problems in consistency because now you have to get back there by the time you get to impact.
I would agree with that, and I would also say maybe something that may be a little more obscure is that if you take joints right to their end range, and something's a little different in the swing. No swing's ever the same, and our body's able to, without our awareness, if we have a little bit more wrist cock in one swing, well, then we'll adjust by shifting our pressure a little bit later, or we'll have a little bit more bend in our elbow. Studies with free throw shooters have shown that. So if you look at, say, Steve Nash, who's lights out free throw shooter, you would think that if you looked at his, equivalent to like an AMM 3D or a golf biodynamics, if we had like sensors showing wrist, elbow, and shoulder angles, you would think that if he took 100 free throws, all those traces would just lay over top of each other. If we looked at all his elbow angles, all his shoulder, it would just be boom, this guy's nailing every free throw. What you'd see is they don't. They're all over the place. Probably more variability in his shoulder angle than maybe you or me taking free throws. He's probably not aware of it. I'm sure he's not. But you'd see what Steve Nash was doing. This was Bernstein done this a long time ago with people with blacksmiths hitting over and over again. Is that he's going to end up getting the same result, the ball going in the hoop. Maybe his elbow angle works a little different, but you're going to see a compensation at the wrist and shoulder. Or maybe probably the easier way to think of it is something that the shoulder's doing, but then you see compensations at the elbow and wrist to still result in a successful shot. If you get a joint to an end range where it can't make a compensation, now I think our body doesn't have the ability then to make those compensations. So it's like, oh, I've done something at this joint. Okay, well, gee, I'd really like to be able to have a little more wrist cock. That's sorry. Everything's maxed out. We can only go one way with all these joints. Now we're going to see more variability where it matters, which is when the club head impacts the ball. If we go to those real extremes, an aside, but I think that's probably why you don't see too many golfers with a straight trail elbow at impact. From a pure velocity standpoint, it might be a good thing, but like a hammer thrower, both those arms are going to be straight. But if we want to be able to have some wiggle room to make some adjustments, if we make some other errors in the swing, I don't want to have those joints be perfectly straight. It's not going to give me as many degrees of freedom to work with during the swing.
So since we're on the distance subject and actually like club head speed subject, which usually translates into distance, of course, when ground forces are happening, because I know that if we see guys who have a tremendous amount of verticals going on in their swing, they're creating a lot more ground force. They're pushing up off the ground. A good example would be Bubba Watson. He's got that, big vertical leap almost on his toes when he hits the ball. Is there a specific, let's say, because I saw a study that was presented at the PGA show, and what the gentleman did was he, in actually 2D, not 3D, but he showed it in comparison with 3D. But he showed a line at the waist level during the swing, and when the player went to the top, that their waist kind of dropped a little bit below that line, and then as they came into impact, they really raised way above that line through impact, and he found that when they did that, they created a lot more power in their swing. So are those some things that you've ever looked at or studied in that way as to how much more ground force is being created to create more power, and is there more verticals happening?
Yeah, of all the variables that I've looked at from the ground, what horizontal forces, torques at various times in the swing, the peak vertical ground reaction force at specific times in the swing is even when controlled for body weight, is by far the best predictor of club head speed. To me, it just comes right back to what we were talking about 5 minutes ago, the work energy theorem, and hey, okay, well, we got an object. How do we get it moving with as much kinetic energy as possible? We want to do as much work on it as possible. Might not seem to be a direct link here, but from my perspective, that having that really high vertical ground reaction force at the right time in the swing will actually contribute to the rotational energy, the rotational work that's done on the club. We want to apply, if I can pull out a pen here. Am I allowed to do animations?
Absolutely. because we're going to have this on video too. So this will go on my YouTube channel. And so the animation thing is awesome. So, I mean, that's great. So,
okay. So, well, I'll try to use my green pen here. So let's say, probably better if I'll pretend I'm a righty. If this is the club head out here.
Yep.
Let's just say we get down to shaft parallel in the downswing. Well, we want this club to rotate with as much speed as possible. So we want to produce as much torque on this club as possible from here down impact.
Yep.
So I would love to have that thing rotating as fast as possible. Torque's going to do that. Center of gravity of this club is going to be down here somewhere by the club head.
Yep.
This is where we're applying force to the handle.
Yes.
Well, if I want to produce as much torque on this pen right now in this position, I am going to want to pull up hard on this handle in that direction. Bigger that force is in that direction, the bigger the torque is. We got the torque is force times moment arm, so bigger that is, the bigger the force. The moment arm is distance from here to that center of gravity. Well, it's going to be very challenging for me to maximize that force pulling up here to get that pen to rotate without seeing that also happen at the ground level. So the ground force is a ground reaction force. So think of it, probably maybe the easier way to think of it is, I want to pull up in this handle as hard as I can to produce as much torque in this club to get it rotating. Okay, well, that's going to require me to contract my muscles that are going to allow me to pull my hands up or to apply a force in that direction. Well, go back to the shoulder. Well, then I want my shoulder starting to move up. Okay, well, how do I get my shoulder to move up? Well, I probably want to be extending at my lead hip and my lead knee. Okay, well, how do I do that? Well, I want to fire my quads. I want to fire my hamstrings. I want to do things that are going to seem quite similar to a jumping motion. So while it might seem, why would I want to go up and down in the swing to make this club head move faster in that direction? That's the link that we're talking about. So yes. I pull up hard here, that's going to get this club head to swing fast down in that direction.
Yep.
And if you can maximize that vertical ground reaction force at just the right time in the swing, then you're going to maximize that torque and the work being done in the rotational sense in that club, which is going to maximize the energy in the club, which means you're going to get high club head speed. It's, to me, there's so many things that just make it clear in my mind. If you look at junior players who don't have the ability to maybe generate force, they don't have very strong forearm and hand muscles to generate that torque by manipulating the club, say, with their hands, they need to use the actual linear forces that would just passively go into the club through the wrist, even if we didn't have wrist muscles, if we just, duct-taped, cut the hands off and duct-taped the butt of the wrist to the club, we could still get some club head speed. If you look at juniors, they don't have those added ways to get club head speed. That's why they all jump, and I think then when you get strong enough and you decide, well, I only need so much club head speed, I can still play on tour with 110 or 150 miles an hour club head speed. So, hey, if you honestly believe that by not jumping you're more consistent, sure, let's coach that out of the player. My opinion, I would say don't. I would say look at Bubba Watson. That's probably why he could still swing at 117, 118 and stay really level-footed on the ground.
Yeah.
But the guy does a pretty good job finding the center of the face with that jump. Would he have a couple of green jackets if he wasn't able to bomb it over the corner on, 13 and maybe not.
Probably not.
Probably not. So my opinion, I realize we're getting off maybe a little off tangent here, Berner, but my thought is that at the elite level, you shouldn't be trying to do a technique that's less difficult. Why limit this really, really high-level human being who's got all the time in the world to practice?
Right.
So if you can get another 4 or 5 mile an hour club head speed by jumping and learn to be consistent with it, Why wouldn't you? You know, I can think of examples in other sports, jump serve and volleyball. You know, when it first came around, oh, you can't jump serve. You're only getting 1 out of every 5 serves over the net. Yeah, but imagine if I could actually get consistent at it. Oh, you'll never get consistent. It's too challenging. Stay on the ground, you know, hit your float serve. Well, you know what? Someone said, I'm a damn good athlete, more coordinated than the average volleyball player. I'm going to work on this. And now it's just commonplace. It's not, you wouldn't look at someone and say, oh, it's too challenging. No, you'd say, no, if you want to play elite volleyball, you know, and you're an outside hitter, you better learn to have a smoking hard jump serve. You know, a lot of people could say, the Fosbury flop, gee, that's so tough. Is it worth trying to learn that complicated movement for another 2 or 3 centimeters? Yeah. You know, rotational movement and shot put. Still some guys win with the glide, but hey, you know what? That extra challenge of rotating around the circle as fast as I can, it's going to theoretically enable me to do more work on that shot put. If I go around the circle, maybe I'll apply force for a longer distance. Yeah, but it's so challenging. Don't do that. All right, I don't need to win at the Olympics. Right? It's worth it for that little extra bit. So I would say, you know, someone said to me in 20 years, is someone going to be Happy Gilmoreing a driver to reach a 630-yard par 5 and 2? Maybe. Why not? You know, if they can still find the center of the face, get some another 5-mile-an-hour club head speed, why not?
Sure. So essentially, then the time that for our average player, because that's a lot of our, and of course we have a lot of instructors who listen to this show too, but for our average players, we're looking at if they're going to try this and experiment with it, which I always suggest to all players to experiment with things, because sometimes that takes more time, but what it does is it kind of gives you an understanding and a feel of manufacturing shots that if you didn't do that, you would never be able to, you know, pull them off. So essentially, if we can say that club is parallel to the ground, that's when they should start on the downswing. That's when they should start experimenting with that vertical motion to create more club head speed. It would not be to their advantage to do it if it was less than parallel to the ground. So in other words, if I take a pen here and I say that if it was up here, then it wouldn't, it could really maybe cause them to hit thinner shots, or if it's down here. So it's like, what I'm trying to find out for our listeners is in relation, because they can understand where the club is on its way down, would there be an optimal spot for them to start to work on this? Or is that an individual thing?
Yeah, the reason why I picked shaft parallel, 2 reasons. One is that it's easy to display the torque, because things are 90 degrees and people can picture shaft parallel. That's not what the data says. That's not where you should be maximizing the ground force, and it's not necessarily where you're maximizing the force in the club. But I think what the data says and what the average golfer is going to feel in trying to accomplish what the data says are 2 very different things. I like your approach, and I would say think about, you know, trying to have some more, you know, if you can do it without losing consistency, it's probably not a bad thing just to try. We're not talking, you know, moving a foot up or down here. Right?
Sure, of course. We're talking about a smaller area.
Yeah.
I just use that as an exaggeration, but I think that, you know, as people who study the golf swing, yourself, who studies it a lot more in depth than I do, I study it fairly in depth because that's what I do. I teach. And then, of course, I study it all by being able to do this show and ask questions to people like yourself and to other instructors, and that not only helps expand my knowledge, but it also helps expand the knowledge of my listeners and other instructors. That's the main reason why I do this show, is to contribute to golf in every way that I can and make it better for everybody. If I can do that, then I'm achieving my goal. But for the average player, I think a lot of them, they don't think about these things at all. They
No.
don't even know where to start. So if we can kind of give them a little starting point, then at least they can go, oh, yeah, I can experiment with this now. And Dr. MacKenzie said I should think about this when I listen to that podcast. So maybe I should try starting here. And then I can go to different points from there to find out what works best for me and what are the best results.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And where you feel like you are moving up or down or applying the most force club might be very different from reality. But I think by experimenting, you're hitting balls. Maybe you've got a launch monitor. Maybe you got some indication of club head speed. And that's where you kind of just work on those feels. And I'm going to try to feel like I'm pulling up harder on the club here. Maybe you don't even think about the ground. Maybe you just think about what you're doing to the handle of the club. Maybe you think about the ground. I'm going to try and, once I feel that club starting down and it gets to maybe before shaft parallel, that's where I'm going to start to feel like I'm really driving up with my lead side. I'm going to really push up hard with that lead side. In reality, it's interesting, you talk about maybe snapping the lead leg straight and potentially that, causing damage for some people. I would say, actually, if you look at a guy like Bubba, who probably does it just as much as anybody, the reality is if you do that early enough, there's going to be very little ground force underneath that lead foot. His foot, Patrick Reed or Scott Stallings, those guys, their foot turns out, their toes end up pointing towards the target because they have so little ground force through impact on that foot. They've got this huge vertical force coming through the ground on that foot, sends up the left side into the air, so to speak. But actually, by snapping that leg straight to a certain extent, almost probably reduces the, that torsional stress that would be on the knee because there's so little, these guys got spikes on their shoes, yet they turn relatively easy on the air. If you watch Bubba's some slow motion of Bubba's feet, I don't think he's got a ton of torque on that lead knee.
I agree. I think that vertical reduces that, like you said, and puts less stress. And that's something that I think a lot of players don't really think about as much in general. So this has been a wonderful interview. I thank you so much for taking the time. We really almost went an hour, which I really appreciate that. But there's so many things that you can give us insight to that while I had my opportunity, I wanted to take full advantage. And I appreciate your graciousness in doing it for us. So if there's anybody who would like to get in touch with you or ask you any of these questions on their own, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Google my name. I think I'm the only Sasho MacKenzie on the internet, and my stuff pops up. You can send me an email. That's probably I'm a member of several Facebook forums. If it's something that a golf instructor would think that would be of interest to other golf instructors, then that's probably a good venue to do it. And not just myself, but there's some other people that might have knowledge in that area that could chime in, as well as other golf instructors that have a different perspective on things. So Facebook forums are pretty good. I typically don't. I've kind of moved away from conversing with the average golfer. I think my role is maybe to work with the instructors, and I think that the instructors do a pretty good job of discussing this stuff with the golfers.
Sure, absolutely. Are there any things that you're going to have in the future that are papers or research papers or studies that that people can look into or read, or that'll be available to the public by any chance?
Yeah, I post all my publications on my my webpage under the recent publications section. I've actually the last 2 years I've spent a lot of time with equipment companies in industry, and my published research activity has gone down. But I'm sitting now on 4 or 5 papers that I'm going to start shooting out in the coming months. Fortunately, there's usually some some significant turnaround times with scientific journals.
Sure.
But definitely between now and 2017, there should be 4 or 5 really interesting articles. I've got some really neat stuff on shaft stiffness and some center pressure stuff, obviously, matching clubs, effect of different head weights with drivers, the effect of training with different weighted clubs. So a lot of stuff coming out. I've kind of dabbled in a bit of everything over the last few years.
Great. Well, thanks again for being our guest. And what we always say here on Breaking Par is, when we leave, is try to keep it in the short grass.
Okay, I'll do that.
All right, great. Thanks so much.
Okay, bye.